The Colorado sun dipped low over the Rockies. It painted the sky a soft orange. Light spilled across the cracked porch of Walter's little house in Durango. The air carried that familiar bite of pine mixed with a whiff of oil and rubber, the kind of smell that clung to his hands back when he fixed bikes for half the town. It was a quiet September evening. Crickets started their chorus early, and a pickup truck hummed faintly down Main Street. Walter sat in his old rocking chair. His rough hands, once nimble with wrenches and chains, rested on a rusty toolbox. Its lid creaked open to reveal a tangle of vintage bike tools he'd collected over the years. At 68, he'd hung up his repair apron a while back. He traded the shop for rides around town, spinning tales about his treasures for anyone who'd listen. But as he ran his thumb over a worn spoke wrench, a sharp jolt shot up his calf, a cramp that made him suck in a breath and grit his teeth. He rocked forward. The chair groaned under him, and he rubbed his leg with the ache a stubborn knot beneath his faded jeans. It had been creeping up on him for months now. These cramps that hit like a sneak attack, waking him at night with his toes curled tight or catching him mid-step during a ride. He'd shrug it off at first, figuring it was just the years piling on, maybe too many cold mornings in the shop. But lately it wasn't just a once-in-a-while thing. Yesterday he'd pedaled down to the corner store 2 blocks tops, and halfway there his calf locked up, forcing him off the bike. He'd hobbled to a bench. His Schwinn leaned against a lamppost while the Durango breeze mocked him as he caught his breath with his leg throbbing like it had never let go. He'd always been the guy who could ride circles around the neighborhood, fixing flats for kids on the block. But now at 68 his legs were turning on him. A cold fear started pedaling through his mind. Was this the start of the end? Walter eased himself up. His boots scuffed the porch boards. He shuffled inside with the warm glow of his kitchen a small comfort against the chill in his bones. The place still smelled like the old days, grease on his tools, coffee on the stove, a hint of leather from the bike seat he'd patched last week. He'd fixed bikes through everything, rainy summers, snowy winters, even after his wife Ellie passed 6 years back, telling his son stories about each wrench and chain he'd saved. But now he gripped the counter with his leg twitching and his hands shaky. He felt something new, not just tired but scared. He'd ignored it too long. The cramps, the restless nights. Last week he'd called Doc Harper with his voice low. "Hey Doc, my legs, they're locking up bad, what's going on?" She'd listened with her tone calm but firm and told him to come in, promising answers he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. He'd rolled up to the clinic that morning with the sun climbing over the mountains. The town woke up with the clatter of coffee shops and pickup trucks. Doc Harper's office smelled like antiseptic and that faint pine scent that stuck to everything in Durango. Her desk stacked with charts, her eyes steady as she flipped through his file. "Walter," she'd said leaning in, "these leg cramps, they're no joke at your age. Your muscles are wearing down, sarcopenia we call it. And you're low on some key stuff: protein, potassium, magnesium." He blinked with the words hitting like a flat tire. Sarcopenia, cramps stealing his legs, his biker's body giving out in ways he hadn't seen coming. "It's why your legs are screaming," she went on. "Left alone, it could steal your riding days, maybe more." "So what now?" he'd asked with his throat tight, and she'd nodded. 5 foods can fix this: eggs, bananas, nuts, sweet potatoes, salmon. Start eating him, strengthen those legs, stop the cramps before they stop you. Walter sank back into his kitchen chair. Doc Harper's words spun in his head like a loose chain, and he stared at the toolbox with its rusty hinges glinting in the light. He'd walked in expecting maybe some pills or a quick fix, not a grocery list. Eggs for protein, bananas for potassium, nuts for magnesium, sweet potatoes for energy, salmon for whatever magic it had, all backed by science, she'd said, tossing out Mayo Clinic and Journal of Gerontology like they were old buddies. He'd grabbed the list with his heart thumping with a mix of hope and doubt. Could these foods keep his legs rolling? Or was it too simple to outrun the cramps that woke him, the stiffness that slowed him, the fear that his biking days were done? He got up with his boots heavy on the floor and shuffled to the fridge with its hum a steady friend in the quiet house. He'd always eaten decent, burgers at the diner, eggs now and then, a beer with the guys, but not like this, not with purpose. He pulled out an egg, its shell cool in his palm, and cracked it into a skillet with the sizzle popping loud against the crickets outside. Doc Harper had said it, 6 grams of protein, some vitamin D, good for muscle repair. Mayo Clinic swore it. He fried it up with the yolk runny like he liked it and ate it slow by the window. The mountain stood a dark blur in the dusk. His legs still ached, but his mind kicked into gear. Could this really work? Before we dig deeper, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you tuning in from? If these insights about living stronger past 65 hit home, share your thoughts below. Consider subscribing. Things are heating up, and you won't want to miss what's next. He shuffled back to the porch with the toolbox waiting. He eased into the rocker, his fingers brushing a rusty chain tool, a piece he'd saved from his first shop job. He'd loved this, riding through town, spinning yarns about every wrench, every fix with his legs pumping like they'd never quit. He'd fixed bikes for decades with hands steady and stories sharp, showing his son how to tighten a spoke just right. But now he couldn't ride 2 blocks without stopping, couldn't sleep without waking up groaning, couldn't hold a wrench without his calf seizing. He'd dozed off last night with the wind rattling the windows and snapped awake at 2 with his leg cramping so hard he'd kicked the sheets off with toes curling and breath short as he gripped the bed frame. Pain stuck around till morning, leaving him beat, shaky, scared. Walter rocked slow with his breath hitching. He rubbed his leg again with the ache, a mean little reminder he couldn't dodge. Doc Harper's list sat on the table: 5 foods, 5 shots, eggs to fix his muscles, bananas to calm his nerves, nuts to balance him out, sweet potatoes to fuel him up, salmon to smooth things over. All straight from the science book, sheet said. He'd trusted his legs once, strong, tough, a biker's pride. But now at 68, they were letting him down. The research didn't lie. Journal of Gerontology said cramps could mean weak muscles. Mayo Clinic warned seniors over 65 were prone to this if they didn't eat right. And he felt it all with every twitch, a sign his riding days might be slipping through his fingers. He stood with his boots by the door calling him and stepped outside. The gravel crunched under his slow shuffle. He'd ridden this street yesterday, halfway to the store, his toolbox rattling in the basket, and stopped with his calf locking and his breath short as he sank to the curb with the Rockies staring him down. The dusk cooled his skin, and he felt the fear settle in deep. What if he couldn't ride anymore? What if his legs, the freedom, the stories, the fixes, were gone for good? He'd pedaled hard, told tales, built a life on legs that moved. But now they were stalling, and the question burned in his gut. Why were they failing him when he'd kept them rolling so long? Walter shuffled back inside with his cane by the wall, a shadow he hadn't touched. Not yet. He sank into the rocker with the skillet still warm on the counter. Doc Harper's voice echoed. 5 foods. Start now. Strengthen those legs. He'd fried the egg and felt its promise. But the cramps still hit. The stiffness still slowed him. The nights still broke him apart. He thought about his tools, the wrenches, the chains, the rides he'd shared with his son, the life he'd spun on those wheels. He'd wanted these years to roll on, to ride, to fix, to breathe the mountain air, but they were grinding down cramp by cramp, and he couldn't just sit there. He reached for the list with his fingers brushing the paper and felt a spark kick in. Fear, sure, but a flicker of grit too. The Rockies loomed out there with the night stretching wide, and he wondered, could these 5 foods, eggs, bananas, nuts, sweet potatoes, salmon, really stop the cramps and save his legs? He didn't know, not yet, but as the wrench glinted in the toolbox and the ache pulsed in his calf, the question roared loud. Could something as simple as what he ate every day keep him riding? Or was it already too late? The October chill crept into Durango. Shadows stretched long from the Rockies over Walter's small Colorado home. Wind rattled the loose shingles and carried the sharp scent of pine through the cracked kitchen window. The old stove glowed with weak heat that barely cut the cold. A skillet sat on the counter with yolk drying from this morning's egg. Walter slumped in his rocking chair. His rough hands, once quick with gears and spokes, rested on the rusty toolbox. Its lid popped open to show off his vintage wrenches and chains glinting faintly. At 68, he stared at a spoke wrench with its edges worn smooth from years in the shop. He rubbed his calf with the ache still humming under his jeans. He'd started Doc Harper's plan with 5 foods to stop those leg cramps and keep his legs strong. But outside crickets chirped, and the first 3 weren't holding back the grind. Walter rocked slowly with the chair creaking like an old bike frame. A dull throb pulsed through his leg sharp enough to make him wince, a reminder of last night's fight. These cramps had woken him for weeks. Lately, they'd turned meaner and fiercer, like his body was out to get him. He'd kicked off with eggs that week, frying one each morning in the quiet house. The sizzle filled the silence with yolk runny, just how he liked it. Doc Harper had laid it out with 6 grams of protein and some vitamin D. Mayo Clinic saying it'd patch up his muscles and fight that sarcopenia. He'd eat it slow by the window with the Rockies staring back. For an hour or 2 his calf eased and his hands felt steadier on his tools. But last night it hit anyway with a cramp so bad he'd bolted upright in bed. His toes curled tight and his breath caught as he gripped the headboard with the eggs' promise fading fast. He stood with boots scraping the floor. He shuffled to the counter and grabbed a banana from the bowl with the peel soft and yellow, a new habit he'd picked up yesterday. He peeled it slow with the sweet smell hitting him as he took a bite and leaned against the sink. Wind howled outside. Doc Harper had called it a game changer with 420 milligrams of potassium. Journal of Gerontology, swearing it'd calm those twitchy nerves and stop the spasms that kept him up. He'd eaten one each day with the sugar giving him a lift and felt the cramps soften with his leg quieter when he pedaled the yard. But this afternoon he'd taken the Schwinn out with 2 loops around the block and breeze cool on his face. Halfway through, his calf seized with a jolt so sharp he swerved and caught himself on a mailbox, panting as he sank to the curb with the banana's magic gone. Walter turned and glanced at the cane by the wall. He wouldn't touch it, not yet. He shuffled to the pantry and pulled out a jar of almonds. Nuts, third on Doc Harper's list. He'd tossed a handful into his oatmeal this morning with the crunch breaking the silence and the taste earthy on his tongue. She'd said 77 milligrams of magnesium per ounce. Nutrition reviews promising it'd relax those muscles and keep cramps at bay for seniors like him. He'd felt a hint of calm shuffling to the porch and tinkering with a chain tool. But it wasn't enough, with night falling and wind rising as his leg turned on him again. He sank into the rocker with almonds rattling in the jar. The toolbox stared back with its treasures mocking him with their shine. He'd tried that evening with spoke wrench in hand, tweaking an old chain from 72, hoping the eggs, bananas, nuts were doing their job. Science buzzed in his head: Mayo Clinic for protein, Journal of Gerontology for potassium, nutrition reviews for magnesium. But the cramps didn't care with a grind he couldn't fix. He'd ridden strong once with shop buzzing and legs pumping like pistons while tail spun for his son about every tool. Now he couldn't pedal a block or sleep without waking or grip a wrench without shaking with the foods not enough, shafts up not yet. Walter leaned forward with elbows on his knees. He rubbed his face with wind sneaking through the window, cold on his neck. He'd eaten an egg last night, warm and filling, hoping it'd hold him, and drifted off to crickets buzzing. But at 3 it struck with a cramp so fierce his leg locked and he jerked, rolled off the chair with his shoulder hitting the floor and a groan tearing out. The toolbox tipped with his first wrench, shiny from the shop days, clattering free and spinning across the boards as he lay there panting with pain spiking his calf and hands clawing the rug. Night closed in dark and mean. He couldn't move. Tears stung, hot and sudden, like he hadn't shed since Ellie's funeral. That wrench gleamed useless now, tossed aside just like him. He'd followed the list with eggs, bananas, nuts, trusted the science with protein, potassium, magnesium. But it wasn't enough as he hit the floor with legs wrecked and tools scattered while hurt cut deep, deeper than any fall. He'd been steady once, tough, a bike guy through and through. Now he was weak and sleepless and scared, with legs failing night after night and ride after ride. Walter gripped the rug with breath ragged. He sobbed, rough and loud, shaking the quiet house. Too slow, too little sleep, too few fixes with him sprawled here, and strength gone with stories gone and years slipping. Doc Harper's voice echoed, 5 foods, eggs, bananas, nuts, start now. He'd tried with Mayo Clinic promising repair, Journal of Gerontology swearing calm, nutrition reviews vowing ease. But the cramps won and tore him apart, body and soul. He thought of his son with their rides and the life on those wheels. Now he couldn't reach the porch or fix a chain or breathe through the pain. He pulled himself up with hands shaky on the chair, breath uneven as he sank back with wrench cold by his feet. The toolbox sat there with a mess he couldn't face, not now. He reached for it with fingers brushing the metal and almonds mocking him from the table. He'd hit rock bottom with legs locked and hope cracked and tools strewn while wind howled with Rockies cold beyond the pines. He thought of Ellie, the shop, the man he'd been, strong, quick, alive. The question clawed at him. How long could he go like this? How long before the next cramp wasn't just a fall, but a break he couldn't fix? Walter shivered with cold biting his shirt and stared at the list with 5 foods. 3 tried. 2 left, sweet potatoes, salmon. He'd done eggs, bananas, nuts, but the cramps ruled with a gear he couldn't shift. He pictured his porch with his rides and the tools he loved and the life he'd spun on rolling legs. Fear gripped him with them maybe done. The question hung heavy. Why weren't these foods enough to save his legs, his fixes, his years? Night stretched on, cold and unyielding. He felt the fight he hadn't won, not yet. It sank into the ache with one he couldn't pedal away. The October dusk settled over Durango. Rockies faded into a deep purple haze. Wind whipped through the pines and rattled Walter's small Colorado home. The kitchen sat dim. A lamp flickered with jagged shadows across the table. His toolbox lay there with pages crumpled from last night's fall. Walter slumped in his rocking chair. His hands, rough from years of bike fixes, folded in his lap and trembled as he rubbed his aching calf. Crickets chirped outside, restless. At 68, he stared at the mess. 3 foods down, eggs, bananas, nuts, Doc Harper's plan to stop his leg cramps. 2 more waited with a faint spark flickering in the dark. He rocked slow. The chair groaned, a reminder of the night he'd crashed to the floor. His tools scattered with his body broken by cramps he couldn't trust. He'd fried eggs every morning. Protein patched his muscles with Mayo Clinic, saying it fought sarcopenia. But cramps still woke him, sharp and relentless. He'd eaten bananas each day. Potassium calmed his nerves with Journal of Gerontology, swearing it eased spasms. Yet his legs locked and left him winded on the curb. He'd snacked on nuts, almonds mostly. Magnesium relaxed him with nutrition reviews promising relief. Still he'd fallen with wrench hitting the boards, not enough. Walter shifted and winced. His boots scraped with a dull ache throbbing, a ghost of that crash. He couldn't keep going like this. He stood and shuffled to the stove. A sweet potato baked inside with its earthy smell rising as he pulled it out. Steam curled and warmed the chill. Doc Harper had called yesterday. "You're halfway," she'd said with voice steady. "Eggs, bananas, nuts are good, but sweet potatoes, salmon, all 5 every day." She'd laid it out with 500 milligrams of potassium and complex carbs for energy. Harvard Health backed it, fuel to cut cramps for seniors like him. He sliced it open and ate slow by the sink with wind rattling outside. His calf eased a bit, less twitchy. Strength crept in, faint but there. The fall lingered, though, heavy in his bones. Walter turned with boots tapping. He grabbed salmon from the fridge, grilled last night, pink and glistening. Lemon scent hit him as he took a bite and leaned on the counter. Doc Harper pushed it, omega-3s for circulation, vitamin D for muscles. American Journal of Clinical Nutrition said it soothed strain and helped seniors like him. Legs softened with ache fading, but the wrench on the floor still haunted him. He sank back into the rocker. Plate empty, he stared at the toolbox. Its shine jabbed him, a quiet taunt he couldn't shake. He'd fixed bikes once with shop buzzing with life. Legs pumped strong with tails spun for his son about every tool. Now he couldn't ride or sleep or grip with foods helping, not fast enough. Walter leaned forward with hands shaky. He thought of Ellie, her laugh, her hands on chains beside him. He'd lost too much. Rides, sleep, fixes, all slipping away. Science was clear. Sarcopenia ate his muscles. Low potassium sparked spasms. Magnesium gaps tightened his calves with Mayo Clinic laying it out. Seniors like him were prone. He'd let it pile up day by day until it knocked him flat. He'd tried with eggs at dawn and bananas at noon and nuts all day. Sweet potatoes now, salmon sometimes, not enough alone. The fall had crushed him and he couldn't keep wilting. Wind gusted and rattled the panes. A pulse stirred, small, fragile, real. He couldn't keep fading, weak, sleepless, a shadow of the bike guy he'd been. He'd heard it yesterday, chatter at the diner. Old-timers meeting to ride and swap stories and kick dust around town. Bring a tail, one said, and he'd tucked it away, half doubting with legs too shaky. But now with wrench on the floor and list in his pocket, he needed something. Anything to sprout from the wreck. He stood and grabbed his jacket with toolbox under his arm and banana in hand. He peeled it and ate quick with potassium a boost. Stepped outside with gravel crunching under his boots. Breath puffed in the chill with legs aching but pushing on. He shuffled to the park. Air smelled of pine and dust with a dozen gray-haired folks gathered by bike racks. Tires creaked with Hank waving him over, grin wide. Got a story? Hank asked and nodded at the toolbox. Walter paused and pulled out the wrench with voice rusty. This one fixed my first Schwinn 72. He climbed on with hands clumsy on the bars. Eggs gave strength with bananas calm and nuts ease with sweet potato fuel and salmon flow. They rolled out slow and easy with path winding under pines. His calf twitched once, and he stretched it with old tricks kicking in. Kept going with chatter humming around him. They stopped by the river with water glinting, and he told it. Schwinn fix, wrench's first win. Voice shaky, it came alive. Hank clapped his back. You've still got it. Walter nodded with breath rough, slipping out shaky. He rode home, with boots tapping less. Dusk softened with Rockies watching quiet. He wasn't fixed, not close, with cramps lurking and fall stinging. But that ride with wrench in hand and pedals turning sparked something. A seed in the wreck with a hint of the guy who'd rolled through life. He sank into the rocker with toolbox beside him and pines bent standing. Doc Harper's list replayed: eggs, bananas, nuts, sweet potatoes, salmon. All 5, all his, all promises half kept with Mayo Clinic saying protein rebuilt and Journal of Gerontology swearing potassium calmed. Nutrition reviews vowing magnesium eased with Harvard Health promising carbs fueled and American Journal of Clinical Nutrition claiming omega-3s healed. Small but real, not enough alone, a start together. He didn't know, not yet, how to bloom full. Wind died down with groups' laughs echoing and a question shifted. Could he tin these foods, these roots, into legs that ride again? Night stretched out, cool still. Walter clutched the wrench with hope sprouting faint in the dusk. A fight, not one, but growing. November snapped into Durango with a crisp bite. The Rockies stood tall with sharp peaks under a pale Colorado sky. Sun peeked through pines and warmed Walter's porch where oil and rubber scents lingered. The kitchen buzzed. A skillet sizzled with eggs and sweet potato baked inside, with earthy sweetness filling the air. Walter sat at the table with hands steady polishing his first spoke wrench from 72. At 68 he rocked slow. His cane leaned in the corner, untouched lately. He'd started battered with leg cramps, shaking his biking days and tools scattered, but now he munched a banana with wind whispering outside. He'd woven all 5 foods in with Doc Harper's plan. Eggs, bananas, nuts, sweet potatoes, salmon, every day now. The ride ahead would test him, hard and real. Walter stood with boots soft on the hardwood. He shuffled to the porch with Schwinn by the rail and toolbox under his arm. Legs hummed stronger than months before. He'd ridden with the group 3 times since that spark. Pedaled slow with Hank and swapped tales of fixes with foods kicking in. Eggs rebuilt with bananas calming and nuts easing while sweet potatoes fueled and salmon flowed. Eggs each morning with protein strong, and Mayo Clinic swearing it fought sarcopenia. Bananas each day with potassium steady, and Journal of Gerontology promising no spasms. Nuts each afternoon with magnesium soft, and nutrition reviews vowing relief. Sweet potatoes each night with carbs for power, and Harvard Health backing it. Salmon twice a week with omega-3s for flow, and American Journal of Clinical Nutrition saying it soothes strain. But that morning the test hit fierce. He'd ridden out with a longer loop to the river trail. Air sharp with pine, and dust with boots pedaling a rhythm he'd clawed back. Halfway a cramp struck with calf locked, and hands slipping with bike wobbling as he crashed to gravel. A grunt tore out. Groups swarmed with Hank yelling, "You okay, Walt?" Pain roared hot and tight with leg dead weight as he clutched dirt with river glinting and mocking him. Doc Harper's voice flashed, "5 foods, strengthen those legs." He felt it with eggs too slow, and bananas too weak, with nuts too late, and sweet potatoes light, and salmon thin. He'd fallen again with legs a busted chain, and ride a dream he couldn't crank. Hank pulled him up and called Doc Harper. Her voice cut through, "Walter's down, cramped bad." She roared in with trucks spitting dust, and face tight checking him fast. "Walter, this is it," she said. Legs on the edge with sarcopenia winning, and muscles starved. All 5 foods, every day, or it's a walker, maybe worse. She didn't flinch. One more crash, no riding, or more than legs quit. He sat with gravel cold beneath him. Her words punched with walker, worse, truth slamming hard. Cramps stole rides and sleep and fixes, and years with him trying. Not enough, hitting the wall. Pain faded slow. Fear sparked with a fire he wouldn't let die. He'd rolled blind cursing cramps, but he wasn't done. Not yet. Doc Harper stuck, all 5, every day. He'd lost too much. Legs, rides, tools, fixing through storms, and spinning tails through loss, with him cranking it now bite by bite. That night wind hushed, and he chose. No more wall, with him weaving these foods and tuning his legs with grit to ride back from the crash. He started next dawn, fierce. Eggs at dawn, with 2 now fried fast, and protein pumping, with Mayo Clinic promising repair. Muscles woke with grip locked solid, and he felt it build. Bananas at noon with 1 or 2, and potassium, flowing, with Journal of Gerontology swearing calm. Cramps quieted with rides stretching, and legs holding longer. Nuts as snacks with almonds in his pocket, and magnesium kicking with nutrition reviews vowing ease. Legs softened with pedals smoothing, and he rolled steady. Sweet potatoes at night with baked whole, and carbs surging with Harvard Health backing power. Energy climbed with steps growing firm, and he stood taller. Salmon 3 times a week with grilled lemon, and omega-3s healing, with American Journal of Clinical Nutrition saying strength. Circulation warmed with calves loosening, and he breathed freer. The group turned shop. He rode weekly with toolbox rattling and Schwinn rolling, fixing flats with Hank, laughing through dust. Ate before with eggs at 6, and bananas at 10, with nuts at 2, and sweet potatoes at 6, and salmon on Fridays. Cramps faded with legs firming and hands sharpening. He wasn't whole, not yet, but rolling crank by crank and bite by bite. Science clicked with protein rebuilding and potassium balancing, with magnesium relaxing and carbs powering, and omega-3s healing, with Mayo Clinic nailing it for seniors. December brought the big ride out to the old mill. Group planned a haul celebrating wheels and grit, with Walter pitching a show, vintage tools, tales he'd spun. "Let's roll what we've got," he said. They cheered with chest puffed, and he led. Worked weeks with eggs at dawn and bananas at noon, with nuts daily and sweet potatoes nightly, and salmon Fridays with hands steady and legs tough. He rode mornings with slow loops, then long ones. Calf stayed quiet with tools gleaming and list beating in his blood. The day hit with park alive with bikes, and mill trail lined with pines. His display stood with wrenches, chains, 72 Schwinn frame shining. Eggs and bananas shared beside it, with townsfolk rolling in and Hank grinning with kids pointing. Bikes parked with air thick with pine and grease. Walter stood tall with cane gone. Legs solid as he spun the tail. First wrench, with crowd clapping and son nodding from back with neighbors hollering. Hank slapped his shoulder. "You're the bike guy still." He grinned with eyes misty and Schwinn steady beside him. Rocky's glowed with peaks sharp and sun, and Ellie's laugh rode the breeze. Life fixed with every turn. He'd nearly lost it with cramps, stealing nights, and weakness taking falls, and tools slipping. Doc Harper's truths hit with sarcopenia's grind and potassium's gap, with magnesium's lack and energy's fade and strain's grip, with Journal of Gerontology warning and Mayo Clinic proving. He fought with eggs rebuilding and bananas calming, with nuts easing and sweet potatoes fueling and salmon healing. Small bites with steady rides and body retuned gear by gear. Faced the crash with its jolt and rolled out, not to limp, to live. Ride ended with cheers fading. He stood with toolbox beside him and Rocky's glowing beyond pines. "One more?" Hank asked, and Walter laughed, grabbing his Schwinn with wrench ready. Wind hummed with day his, and he pedaled home. No wobble or cramp, with foods kicking his legs and fixes sparking his soul. Not the guy he'd been with 68 years deep and falls behind, but new. Biker reclaimed, fixer renewed. He sank into his porch chair with nights soft. Toolbox open with chain tail in his head, eggs on stove, bananas by sink, nuts on table, sweet potatoes in oven, salmon in fridge. Cramps gone with years retuned, and fight won. After 65, he thought, your legs, yours to fix, food, grit. Rocky stood quiet and clear with Walter leaning back and shop's hum in his chest. Rolled to the edge with its shake and pedaled back strong.